Continuing chapter 6 of part 7. There was no point of contact between Jesus and Herod. If he had addressed Jesus with any proper desire to know any proper thing, Herod would doubtless have had a word from the great teacher. Pilate was a time-serving coward. No, I think the whole thing was Pilate was brave and got done what needed to be done rather than holding back. And Caiaphas, a hypocritical bigot. A person's not a bigot because they express dislike of something they're not a part of. Whether it's a secular or sacred thing, But Jesus talked with them. Herod's frivolous licentiousness had eaten his whole manhood out. And now more than ever, there's risks involved in extramarital affairs. There's no denying that. And more people are afflicted by those diseases and such than ever before. I mean, of course, the number's higher, but the percentages is significantly higher too. Furted by the profound, majestic, the awful silence of Jesus, Herod and his military guard set him at naught, and mocked him, and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back to Pilate. If we were writing a poem instead of a history, we might indulge in the descriptions of the probable reflections of Herod after the speechless prophet of Galilee had gone out of his presence, although Herod was so mean that he could allow an uncondemned man who had been tortured all night to remain bound and to be insulted in his presence. Even that bad prince did not have heart to say that there was in him anything worthy of death. Or perhaps they just left that out, right? Because how can these things be done against John the Baptist? And the idea, no, Jesus, I can't do it against Jesus. The same sort of person would have done the same sort of thing, right? Or could have, anyways. Section 7. Back to Pilate. Back to Pilate is Jesus now sent. We do not know whether Pilate was in the Tower of Antonia and Herod occupying the space of his father, which is said to have exceeded the temple in splendor, but in any case the distance was not great. The troubled procurator discovered that he had appeased Herod, but had not shifted the responsibility of the most perplexing case. When he saw Jesus brought back wearing a robe of mockery, it plainly confirmed his suspicion that the accused was innocent. The greater part of his public life had been passed in the territory of Herod, who must have known the fact. If Jesus had been a seditious person, his treatment of the prisoner plainly said that Herod regarded his kingly pretension as a harmless vagary, not fit to be treated seriously by any ruler. Then Pilate called the Sanhedrim to him, and addressed them thus: You have brought this man to me as one who perverts the people, a revolutionary demagogue. And see, I have examined him in your presence, and have found no fault in this man touching those things whereof you accuse him. Neither did Herod, for he sent him to us. And see, nothing deserving of death has been done by him. I will scourge and release him. It is quite evident that Pilate had no feelings of malignity against Jesus. He was really desirous of releasing him, while desirous at the same time of pleasing the Sanhedrim. As far as practicable, he appeases to the fact that he had taken cognizance of the case, had heard the indictment, and had openly conducted the trial in their presence, so that they could put in any proofs they thought likely to convict. And he had been willing to convict, and had shown his willingness by sending the prisoner to Herod, a native prince and a co-religionist of theirs, as the ruler in whose jurisdiction the most of the life of Jesus had been spent, and where, as they had alleged, Jesus had stirred up the people. No proof of seditious behavior had appeared. This man might be a wild enthusiast, but he was not a dangerous revolutionist. He should, therefore, scourge him and release him. This was a great error and most un-Roman. The man was innocent or guilty. If innocent, his release was imperative. If guilty, the judge should not have been endeavoring to protect him. But Pilate had his political difficulties, and his office was sweet to him. Well, okay, the guy turned over some tables. Just whip him and let him go. See, that would have been the real thing, right? Moreover, he may have hoped to satisfy the rancor of the churchmen by the scourging of this young heretic, and thus spare the young man's life. In the meantime, that ecclesiastical party were busy with the multitude, inciting them to violent demonstration. They had been telling the people that Jesus had blasphemed before the Sanhedrin, the high council of the nation, claiming to be Jehovah. It is always to be remembered that the people expected the Messiah to be a man and not a god, and not even an angel, certainly not Jehovah, because all the prophecies were against that, and even the word is against that. If you say that he is Christos, he says that much. You say that he's omniwall. Avatar. Rasulullah, whatever. Something sent him. So, yeah. Of course, we don't pronounce the J and the V if we're going to be in that language. That tonic was written and that they spoke at the time, the Aramea, as it's spelled out. Basically A-R-M-Y-A. Blasphemy was the supreme crime in their code of ethics. It was because Jesus was a good man, such a very good man, and exercised such a great moral power that they regarded him as about to be their Messiah. If, however, he had blasphemed in the presence of the elders of his people, he could be nothing to them but a deceiver. The passions of the mob were adroitly plied by these wily and bitter ecclesiastics, and they were prepared to show an outbreak of passionate reactionary feeling against Jesus. Pilate does not seem to have calculated on this side of affairs when he resolved to appeal from the clergy to the laity, from the priests to the people. He must have known something of the personal popularity of the young prophet and hoped to be able to array the people against the rulers. For that purpose, apparently, he gathered them together, and when they were assembled, they reminded him of the custom which had added to the festivity of the Passover by the release of some prisoner. How long this had been a custom we know not, nor can we now determine whether it was of purely Jewish or purely Roman origin. The Romans were accustomed to propitiate conquered peoples by acts of political grace. A parallel between a malefactor and the goat slain on Atonement Day may have inclined the Israelites to execute great criminals on festivals, which was done around the world. This people of other faiths was like, well, okay, let's wait to Lunasa, that week into August was particularly a time where they're like, no, is there anybody we need to execute? Which keeping people locked up for months just so they can. Seriously, that's where Burning Man comes from. So, and their disposition to release a prisoner on the feast might be referred to the goat, which was let go to free into the desert. And it's interesting for Azazel, Malik Taus, that phrase, right? Because things creep in when people write the book with their own hand. It wasn't that they intended to be satanic or polytheist or something, but some things from some of those paths make their way in when people write the book with their own hand rather than faithfully just pass on the revelation and the inspiration. At any rate, the custom existed, and when Pilate came before the mob, they broke into a demand that he should comply with the custom, which gave them any prisoner they might demand, no matter what his crime. It seems to have flashed upon Pilate as a bright idea. He could now turn this demand to the account of Jesus. He agreed that it was the custom, and that he was prepared to observe it, and then that they might come to his aid against the priests. He fell upon another expedient. Now, outside of the canonical Gospels, even, definitely not outside of the Christian accounts, is any mention of such a tradition. There lay in the prison, at that moment, a man named Barabbas, whose general notoriety as a robber had culminated in an act of sedition in the very metropolis, in which outbreak it was well known that he had committed murder. Well, he wrote the book of Revelations before John of Patmos revised it, and Judah, known as Barabbas, stormed the temple and got killed with his two buddies, fulfilling his own prophecy. His two witnesses died with him. As the ringleader of insurrectionists, and wasn't there a massacre after all that too? By the Romans, who also lay bound with him. It was generally supposed that on this day he would be crucified. Wasn't he a Nazarene too? As in from the town. He had been tried and convicted for the very crime which had been charged on Jesus, namely sedition. No one doubted the guilt of Barabbas, while no one could bring a particle of proof to fasten the charge on Jesus. The contrast was striking. Agreeing to observe the custom, he narrows the choice to a selection between Jesus and Barabbas, not having apparently the shadow of a doubt that the popular voice would at once release Jesus from his peril and Pilate from his perplexity. No, if they had something about Roman rule, they're like, release him, right? To his utter astonishment, the people preferred Barabbas. And again, this is a Christian will accept this account, but the Romans didn't leave information that would have supported this idea. But his trouble was increased at this moment by another circumstance. It had formerly been forbidden the governors of conquered provinces to carry their wives with them to the provincial capitals. This rule had been modified so as to allow the ladies to accompany their lords, the governors being held responsible for any intrigues or derelictions of their spouses. Pilate's wife, whose name as Claudia Procla, and whose fame as a woman of devout habits, leaning kindly to the religion of the people whom her husband ruled, tradition has preserved, moved by a morning dream, sent a messenger to her husband, beseeching him to have nothing to do against Jesus, who, she was persuaded, was a good man. The message came to Pilate while he was on the judgment seat, and while he was endeavoring to solve the problem of saving Jesus and placating the church party, bent on his ruin. Well, ecclesiastical is the right term, because it wasn't that, they worship another hero, we worship Jesus. It's like, see, that would have been the case if they were actually a church party, but, worldly man as he, because church comes from kirk, hero shrine. Worldly man as he was, there was doubtless a tinge of superstition in his heart. He may have had no clear theological opinions, no fixed religious convictions, but all the peoples among whom he had traveled believed in gods, and there was something in this prisoner which strangely influenced him. Perhaps he was a god, and perhaps the gods of mornings and dreams. It may have occurred to his recollection what had been rife in Rome, that the night before great Caesar was assassinated, his wife Calphurnia dreamed that her husband's bloody body fell across her knees. Thus his perplexity was increased, and we see indicated here that perhaps that Christianity comes from the Mithraic idea, right? The Roman sentiment, not the Jewish sentiment, but the Roman sentiment was what resulted in Christianity. Because Christianity is a type of Mithraism. Mithraism goes back thousands of years before, because people say, oh no, it didn't happen until the 3rd century when they were writing, when they were editing the Bible. Of course, they don't point out that editing the Bible part, but he could scarcely persuade himself that the people had made this choice. He was not much of a Democrat, not talking the political party. He could not have believed that the most monstrous falsehood, vox populi voix est, but a few days before, the multitude had come, trooping into Jerusalem, shouting patents to this extraordinarily popular prophet. They certainly could not now prefer Barabbas to him, for Barabbas had made the highway dangerous and had been a common villain. Moreover, he had been condemned for that of which their leaders had accused Jesus. It is this which made Pilate all along suspicious of the ecclesiastics. They preferred a political charge against Jesus, while he knew that in their hearts they did not love the Roman yoke. But Pilate was giving away. Now, see, had this sort of thing really happened, the Barabbas thing would be a sign of opposing the Roman yoke and bringing an air of weakness to the idea of the Roman rule. It's like, oh, they even let this murderer get away. Pilate was giving away. He had already agreed to scourge an innocent man. They pushed him. They cried out all at once. It was the roar of what Burke calls the belliua populace, that wild beasts, the people. It was becoming frightful. Not this man! Away with this fellow!
Release Barabbas to us!
What is the governor to do in this case? Jesus is charged with sedition, and the Jews are proving their loyalty to Rome by urging his destruction. But they are proving their disloyalty by demanding the release of a man convicted of leading a seditious insurrection. Standing on his judgment seat before the tessellated pavement, Pilate demanded, "What shall I do then with Jesus, who is called Christ, whom ye call King of the Jews?"
"Crucify him! Crucify him!"
they exclaimed. A third time the governor interposed. "What evil has he done? Prove a capital crime. I have found no cause of death in him. I will release him, after having scourged him." But the proposition did not pacify them. They cried out the more exceedingly, saying with loud voices,
"Let him be crucified!"
When the populace united with the priests, Pilate gave way. He had shown a weakness of which the priests who hated him took advantage. Perhaps, he reasoned thus, things have reached such a pass that quiet can no more be restored without bloodshed. To release Jesus will not save him from this furious mob who will tear him in pieces. An insurrection will be raised. I shall be compelled to call out the troops. Then several will perish. I shall have to give him up. The weak ruler sent for an ewer of water, and standing in his place, he washed his hands before them all, and again declared the innocence of Jesus. But by this symbolic act, endeavored to throw all responsibility from himself, saying to the mob, "I am innocent of the blood of this just person, but see you to it." The infuriated multitude answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." Then deceiving himself and drugging his consciousness, Pilate consented to their demand and released Barabbas to them. Then Pilate caused Jesus to be scourged. The Roman scourging surpassed the Hebrew in all the particulars of severity. In the latter only, the shoulders were bared. In the former, the whole person. In the latter, the stripes were limited to 40, save one. In the former, there was no limit. It was the punishment given to a slave. The stripes of the lash were loaded with bones or metallic fragments. The scourging of those who were to be crucified was so frightful that the condemned frequently escaped the cross by dying under the thongs. Then the soldiers of Pilate took Jesus away into the common hall, called the Praetorium, probably in the castle of Antonia, and gathered the whole company of the guard, which usually numbered about 400 men. They stripped him again, and on his torn and bleeding shoulders put a scarlet robe, probably some old military coat from the wardrobe of the guardroom. And one of the things that is the risk when you commit a serious crime, theft or an affair or whatever, that the public whipping is something that they may have to consider your health on how they're going to do it, because people would die under the thing. In the Islamic vision, the criminals are not are not punished in a way that's going to kill them unless they're like a murderer or something like that. So they actually consider, okay, can this person take all 40? So do we need to whack them with something smaller or something, right? And the whacking was not over the whole body because you want the person to be able to work afterwards. If they're doing something that the goal is that they get punished and it's a deterrent, you don't want to destroy their ability to work through their punishment. And that's one of the problems with the prison system is what you put people away to the point where, they get out and they're retired, basically aged, or they come out disabled otherwise or whatever. Then they plaited a crown from the twigs of some thorny growth. It may have been the Syrian acacia, the thorns of which are as long as an ordinary finger, but we cannot know what particular kind of thorns were used. It is enough that they intended to mock him and that they were not wanting in cruelty. Now, see, that's not the thing, too. If you're punishing a criminal, it's not about torturing people. The more painful, as well as humiliating, the instrument of their mockery, the more acceptable it would be. Then they put a reed in his hand as a mock scepter. Then they knelt before him and ridiculed him and his nation, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spat on him, and he was bound. The reed was laid in his hands, but he did not hold it. He was perfectly passive. It fell. Some of the guards seized it, and with it drove the thorn crown down upon his head. They smote and mocked him, varying their indignities. Pilate looked on this wild scene. We can conjecture his thoughts from his actions. He must have regarded this whole affair with mingled feelings of perplexity, awe, and apprehension. He had never seen such a sufferer, most majestic amid ridicule, most serene amid tortures. Here was a man fit to be a king anywhere, yet he had not sought to use his marvelous personal influence for personal advancement. There was Barabbas, coarse and brutal, being the vilest kind of person and doing the very things which the priest had charged upon Jesus. If being seditious was such a heinous crime in their eyes, why should they not desire the destruction of Barabbas, who had been convicted of repeated acts under the circumstances of great aggravation? And why should they desire the destruction of Jesus, who was charged with sedition, but against whom there was proved no single seditious word or act? It was a great puzzle. Some other basis than loyalty to Rome lay under this extraordinary zeal of the priests. Pilate determined to make one more effort to save the life of this wonderful sufferer. Taking Jesus, thorn-crowned, covered about with the old robe that burlesqued royalty, faint, worn, haggard, as he must have been after the night and morning of agony and torture, he placed the prisoner once more before the people, reasserting his conviction of the innocence of Jesus. He pointed to this weak and apparently helpless man. He showed how lonely and friendless and powerless he seemed. Jerusalem should be too magnanimous, and Rome too lofty to crush out this poor peasant prophet, for fear he should become too strong for church and state. Now, if you look for a historical Jesus, what you're going to find is you're going to find somebody, that they don't say much about. Somebody that's, some poor hand laborer of a poor mother who the people think is a prophet. Is that the quote? I don't remember exactly where it was, but he said to them, Ecce homo, behold the man, as if he had said, can that be a dangerous person? It was a pathetic appeal, even if Pilate's voice may have been unsteady in making this utterance. But the church hate was not to be touched. Jesus was to be destroyed.
Crucify him, crucify him. Give him the extreme punishment of a slave,
they cried. Pilate said, take you him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. Again, Pilate was not somebody who had taken this, The crafty priests determined, if possible, to make Pilate a tool in their hands by inducing him to acknowledge the verdict, making him thus not a judge in the court of original jurisdiction, but a mere recorder of their authoritative decisions. See, Pilate really would have not gone for that. Said to Pilate, we have a law, and according to the law he ought to die because he made himself the Son of God. Well, a lot of people use the phrase, and so, yeah. And honestly, Jews following the Roman religion, it wasn't, this guy is following a Roman religion and he wants to head a Roman-style religion. And the Romans be like, yeah, so? As long as he doesn't riot or whatever, just leave us alone about it. What definite idea this last phrase conveyed to the mind of Pilate, we cannot tell. Pagan, heathen, Gentile, infidel. Don't use these words just because somebody believes something different than you, or they don't believe in your path or something. But the whole statement made his soul afraid. He was growing weaker and more superstitious. He went back into the judgment hall and sent for Jesus, who said to him, whence are you? The wonderful prisoner, who had uttered no complaint and showed no nervousness, and seemed to take less interest in the whole tragedy than any spectator, held his peace. What? Said Pilate. Do you not speak to me? Do you know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you? Jesus answered, you could have no power against me unless it were given you from above. On this account, he who has delivered me to you has the greater sin. In the judgment of Jesus, Caiaphas is worse than Pilate. All this increased in Pilate a desire to release Jesus. The prisoner was guilty of no crime, was apparently capable of no disturbance, had no marks of wickedness in his history or in his manners, had been very popular with the masses in the rural districts, had displayed the most extraordinary composure during a period of extraordinary peril, had the reputation of a miracle worker, had excited the dreams of Claudia Procla, had called himself the Son of God, and was manifestly the object of intense hatred on the part of the priesthood. Again Pilate sought to release Jesus, but the churchmen had kept their strongest form of argument for the last. They returned to the political aspect of the affair and put it before Pilate thus: "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar." Because it's s, not z, and a, not e, and k, not s. The phrase Caesar's friend, amicus Caesaris, amicus Caesaris, had not only the ordinary signification of the words, but was a title of honor which the emperors were accustomed to bestow upon their representatives ruling over subjugated peoples. It was a most ingenious way of putting the case. It struck Pilate on his weakest side. He was a lover of place, an office seeker who considered the loss of his political position the greatest misfortune, as is shown in the fact that when that did befall him, he retired to Gaul and committed suicide. Well, again, Pilate would not have gone for, "You do what we say, or you're going to lose your position with Rome. We'll make sure of it." No, Pilate might have orchestrated a slaughter of the Sanhedrin if that was the case, right? The priests knew their man, and Pilate knew how insecurely already he held his seat, and that such an accusation, if pressed with show of evidence, would be his ruin at Rome. Tiberius was suspicious. Pilate had been closeted with Jesus. The trial had been informal. They now had much to show. If he had only taken the strong and dignified position which became an imperial procurator and released Jesus as soon as he was convinced that he was innocent and began to feel, perhaps, that he was divine, Pilate would have saved himself. But he had vacillated so long and grown so weak that this last push toppled him from all his intellectual and moral proprieties. He fell. Jesus was brought forth and placed in the judgment seat in what was called the pavement. From the tessellated pavement in front of the judge, and in Hebrew, Gabbatha, the etymology of which is not quite clear. Now, if I had the spelling, I could give you some semantics there, right? The formal ceremonials of a trial were now resumed, because I don't know whether it's a tau or a theth, or if there's a hey at the end, or is it one, is it one ba, the formal ceremonials of a trial were now resumed. Pilate was going to condemn Jesus, but enraged at the defeat of his efforts to release him, he called the attention of the Jewish leaders to the pale and poor prisoner at the bar and said, in derision, "Behold your king." But they called out, "Away, away,
Crucify him."
Still taunting them, knowing that by pronouncing the sentence he should be secure at Rome, and venting his rage on them, said, "Shall I crucify your king?" They answered, "We have no king but Caesar." It was the shriek of a dying nationality. Their earliest ancestors had lived under a theocracy whose king had held court in a pillar of flame and on the top of rocking Sinai. They had no king but Yahweh. Yahweh is derived from an ancient Egyptian formula of, the hey, the ha, the double H thing is reference to eternity. But in that language, we have establishing, we have increasing existence, because huwa is the the word for Eve, but you add the U to it, and in front of it is bringing into. But it's a term for God as a noun and verb. It doesn't really translate as Lord. Their descendants had such kings as the great David and the super splendid Solomon. This very generation of men who were howling around a pagan courthouse to secure the condemnation of Jesus had had hopes of a theocratic Messiah. But their thirst for innocent blood was uncontrollable. They threw up all hopes of the future, as they did all traditions of the past. They lifted the casket that contained the treasure of their nationality and flung it into the maelstrom of the Roman dominion. We have no king but Caesar. The nationality of Abraham and David and Solomon and the Maccabees was surrendered in spirit, as it had been captured in form, to an imperialism whose representative was the dark, suspicious, cruel, and debased Tiberius. We have no king but Caesar. Judaism's loyalty was Judaism's doom. Well, didn't they do the same thing when they set up a secular state in the modern place of Israel, right? So perishes every church and people and man that will have no king but Caesar. Then Pilate sealed their fate and his own by delivering Jesus to be crucified. What the precise form of the sentence was in this case, we cannot now know. The usual formula was ibis ad crucem, go to the cross. Section 8, the last of Judas. I think it is probable that this is the point at which Judas reappears. The condemnation by the Sanhedrin would Sunhutter, or the Shunhutter, I forget how you spell that, but Eam is the plural, right? The condemnation by the Sanhedrin would not have aroused him on any theory of his motives. If he expected Jesus to display superhuman power and deliver himself, it was not reasonable to suppose that this would occur until he was placed in extremis after his condemnation by the Roman authorities. The verdict of the ecclesiastical council would have little terror for any disciple of Jesus, and every Jew knew that it could not issue in capital punishment without the sanction of the procurator. But Judas, who seems to have been with Peter in the palace of the high priest, most probably watched every movement of all the parties, and as Pilate or the priest had seemed to have had the better of the argument, the hopes or fears of Judas had risen or fallen. But now, when he plainly saw that Jesus had received the condemnation of the church, and the sentence had been ratified by the state, and that the master did not pass out of their midst, but had submitted to scourging and mockery and insult, and was apparently not going to put forth any effort for his own rescue, Judas felt the whole ground give way under him. The one huge, dark fact fell on his whole superstructure of reasonings, and it fell. He was smitten with remorse. He had expected no such issue of his conduct, as by a flash of lightning in a tempestuous midnight, a precipice is discovered by the traveler to be at his very feet. So Judas now suddenly saw the abysses of horrible meaning, which were in the words of Jesus, the words that Jesus had spoken at the supper concerning his betrayer. The whole of the beautiful, beneficent life of Jesus rose up before him. He reviewed all the personal kindnesses and forbearance that he had received from the Galilean prophet. There was nothing in the whole character or life of Jesus which Judas could recollect as being any mitigation of the offense of betraying him. If Jesus had ever done a wrong or spoken a word which could warrant the suspicion that he might in some way be injurious to the people, Judas would have employed it as an argument to justify himself to himself. But the life of Jesus was faultless, even Judas being judge. He probably felt that his death was to be a martyrdom so conspicuous that it would be seen by far-off generations, and that his own name would be taught to the children of men from age to age as the synonym of treachery. Now, in Islam and in some cases otherwise, we have this idea of the Prophet says perfected beings are perhaps fallible.